The lecture hall buzzed with quiet chatter as students settled into their seats. Today was different, an air of anticipation and tension filled the room. Whitaker, the university's most respected yet notoriously arrogant mathematics professor, stood at the front, flanked by two other senior professors. He cleared his throat, silencing the room. "Class," he began, his voice smooth but condescending, "we have an interesting case today." His eyes flickered toward the young black student seated in the front row. The professors had already decided this student didn't belong. She was a scholarship student, an outsider in an elite program filled with legacy admissions and students from prestigious backgrounds. The moment she stepped onto campus, they had doubted her. Whitaker smirked. "Let's see if our gifted scholar can handle real mathematics." The challenge was obvious. A complex equation, far beyond the curriculum, was scrawled across the board. It was meant to humiliate her, to prove she didn't belong. The room fell silent as she rose from her seat. Some students exchanged amused glances. Others, those who had seen glimpses of her brilliance, held their breath. She walked to the board, her expression unreadable. Whitaker leaned back, arms crossed. "Take your time," he said, his voice dripping with mock patience. She picked up the chalk, and then, without hesitation, she began to write. The moment the chalk touched the board, the room fell into stunned silence. She didn't hesitate, didn't pause to analyze. Instead, she moved with precision, breaking down the equation with a confidence that sent a ripple through the lecture hall. Whitaker's smirk faded as he watched her effortlessly navigate the impossibly difficult problem. His colleagues shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't supposed to happen. The problem was designed to trap her, to expose her supposed lack of skill. Instead, she was dismantling it, step by step, line by line, with the ease of someone who had mastered the subject far beyond even the professors themselves. Gasps spread across the room. "She's solving it." "No way," one student fumbled for their phone, secretly recording the moment. No one had ever done this before, not this quickly, not this flawlessly. The only sound was the steady scratch of chalk against the board. Professor Caldwell, a senior faculty member seated at the side, leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "That's not just correct," he murmured under his breath. "That's elegant." Whitaker's face twitched, but he quickly covered it with a forced chuckle. "Interesting," he said, voice tight. "But surely she's made a mistake somewhere." She stepped back from the board, setting the chalk down. Then, turning calmly, she met Whitaker's gaze and said, "Would you like to check my work?" The challenge hung in the air. Professor Whitaker hesitated, his eyes scanning the board as if searching for an error. His confidence from earlier had completely vanished. The class held its breath, waiting for his response. A few students leaned forward, eager to witness what would happen next. One of the other professors, Dr. Hamilton, finally stood up. Adjusting his glasses, he walked toward the board. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in his shoulders was cleared. He traced his finger along the equations, mumbling under his breath. "Derivative, correct. Limits applied properly. No sign error." A minute passed. Then another. The longer the silence stretched, the clearer it became. She was right. A murmur spread through the students. Some exchanged shocked glances, others whispered in excitement. The girl they tried to humiliate had just outperformed the experts. Whitaker's jaw tightened. "You must have seen this problem before," he snapped. "There's no way a student, especially a first year, solves this that quickly." A ripple of discomfort spread among the faculty. That's when she did something that left everyone speechless. She walked to the second board, picked up a fresh piece of chalk, and said, "Give me any problem. Right now." The room froze. Professor Caldwell's eyebrows lifted in surprise, while Hamilton actually looked impressed. But Whitaker? He was furious. "I don't have time for games," he said sharply. She smiled. "Then maybe you should stop playing them." The class erupted. Whitaker's face burned red. He had underestimated her. And now? Everyone knew it. The energy in the room was electric. Students whispered among themselves, some barely containing their excitement. Never before had they seen a student challenge a professor so boldly, especially not one like Professor Whitaker. Dr. Hamilton smirked and crossed his arms. Well, Professor Whitaker, he said, amused. She's given you an opportunity. Are you going to take it, or are you going to back down? A flicker of frustration crossed Whitaker's face. His reputation was on the line now. He couldn't just dismiss her without looking weak. He turned to the board and scribbled a new problem, a multivariable calculus equation so complex that some students gasped just looking at it. There, he said smugly, stepping back. Solve that. She didn't hesitate. She picked up the chalk and immediately got to work, her movements swift and confident. Every stroke on the board was precise. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. She was in her element. Whitaker expected her to struggle, to show signs of doubt. Instead, she moved through the problem faster than he thought possible. 5 minutes later, she dropped the chalk. Done. Silence. Dr. Hamilton walked up again, adjusting his glasses. He examined her solution, checking line by line. Then, he chuckled. She's right. The class exploded in whispers and gasps. Whitaker's fists clenched. Impossible. But Hamilton turned to him, a slow smile on his face. Looks like your student just outperformed you, Professor. Mr. Whitman turned to Margaret, his forehead glistening with sweat. Ms. Ellis, I deeply apologize for this misunderstanding. If I had known you were coming. Margaret held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. That's exactly the problem, Mr. Whitman. You shouldn't have to know I'm coming for your staff to treat me, or anyone else, with respect. Olivia's knees wobbled. Ms. Ellis, I swear, we didn't know who you were, she blurted out, her voice desperate. Margaret tilted her head, her gaze unwavering. And what if I wasn't the owner? Would my treatment have been acceptable then? Stephanie stammered, and no, of course not. We were just following store policies. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Store policies? She glanced at Mr. Whitman. Does this store have a policy that says elderly black women can't browse without being treated like criminals? Mr. Whitman paled further. Absolutely not, Ms. Ellis. Our employees are trained to do exactly what they just did. Margaret finished for him, her voice calm but cutting. Olivia and Stephanie had no words left. They stood there, eyes darting between each other, silently pleading for a way out of this mess. Margaret sighed, setting down the expensive necklace she had been eyeing. You see, I came here today not just to shop, but to experience firsthand how customers are treated in my store. And I must say, I'm incredibly disappointed. She turned back to Mr. Whitman. I want a full review of how employees are trained. Effective immediately. Mr. Whitman nodded rapidly. Of course, Ms. Ellis. Whatever you say. Margaret's gaze shifted back to the two women. And as for you two, we'll have to discuss whether you deserve a place in my company. Olivia and Stephanie's faces turned ghostly white. Margaret glanced at her watch. I'll expect a full report by tomorrow morning, Mr. Whitman. She turned to leave, her dignity and power firmly intact. And as she walked away, every employee in the store knew one thing for certain: things were about to change. Margaret strode toward the store's exit, but the heavy silence behind her made her pause. The employees stood frozen, their faces a mix of shock, fear, and realization. Customers, who had been silent witnesses, began murmuring among themselves. Some recorded on their phones, while others shook their heads at the shameful display they had just witnessed. Mr. Whitman rushed forward, his hands slightly trembling. Ms. Ellis, please. Let's not be hasty. Olivia and Stephanie have been with us for years. Perhaps a warning. Margaret turned slowly, her expression unreadable. A warning? Her voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Stephanie, sensing an opening, clasped her hands together. Yes, Ms. Ellis. We've been loyal employees. We work hard. Margaret folded her arms. Tell me something, Stephanie. When I walked into this store, what did you see? Not just from students, but from Dr. Hamilton himself. Professor Whitaker's face burned with humiliation. His challenge had backfired spectacularly. Amira placed the chalk down and faced him. Still a lucky guess, Professor? He had no answer. Professor Whitaker's face remained frozen in disbelief as the students erupted into whispers. Some exchanged wide-eyed glances, others scribbled down notes, trying to understand how Amira had solved the problem so effortlessly. Dr. Hamilton leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a knowing smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Well, he said, breaking the silence, that was quite the display. Brilliant work, Amira. A few students clapped hesitantly, but Whitaker slammed his hand on the desk, silencing the room. This doesn't prove anything, he sneered. One problem doesn't make you a genius. Amira raised an eyebrow, unbothered. Then perhaps you'd like to give me another? A challenging silence stretched between them. Whitaker's pride was too wounded to back down. Fine, he snapped, turning to the board. This time, he wouldn't hold back. He picked up the chalk and began scrawling an exceptionally advanced calculus problem, one so intricate that even the graduate students in the room shifted uncomfortably. When he stepped back, he smirked. Let's see how you handle this. Amira didn't even blink. She studied the problem, her mind working faster than anyone could follow. Then, she started writing. The confidence in her strokes was undeniable. Line by line, she deconstructed the problem, weaving through complex concepts effortlessly. Halfway through, Dr. Hamilton let out a soft chuckle. He saw it already. She was right again. Whitaker's smirk faded as realization dawned. He had given her a problem so difficult that even he struggled with it in his early years. Yet here she was, solving it like it was a simple exercise. When Amira finally placed the chalk down, the answer stared him in the face, flawless. A hush fell over the classroom. Whitaker clenched his jaw. He had lost, and everyone knew it. The tension in the room was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Professor Whitaker's face twisted in disbelief as he stared at the perfectly solved equation. His hands clenched into fists, his pride burning under the weight of his own challenge. The students were silent at first, stunned. Then, a ripple of odd murmurs filled the lecture hall. Did she just? No way. That was impossible. I can't believe this. Dr. Hamilton, watching the scene unfold, couldn't help but smile. He had known Amira's brilliance, but seeing it in action was something else. Professor Whitaker wasn't ready to accept defeat. He turned back to the board, scanning for a flaw, any mistake, anything he could use to discredit her. But the more he examined it, the more his own humiliation settled in. Amira crossed her arms, her voice cool but unwavering. Is there a mistake, Professor? She scrolled through the countless shares, comments, and news articles covering the incident. Even major news outlets had picked up the story. Luxury store owner schools her own staff after being racially profiled. Power move, woman humiliated in boutique reveals she owns it. Margaret shook her head, both amused and slightly overwhelmed. Well, this is unexpected. Lisa laughed. Unexpected? This is a PR goldmine. People are calling the store, asking if you'll be there. Some want to meet you, others just want to shop in a place where they know they'll be respected. Margaret sighed. And what about those employees? Lisa's tone became more serious. Stephanie and Olivia? They're panicking. Apparently, they're getting harassed online. Some people found their profiles, and, well, let's just say they're feeling the consequences of their actions. Margaret frowned. I never wanted them to be bullied. I just wanted them to learn. Lisa hesitated. So, what do you want to do? Margaret stared at the screen, watching as her story continued to spread. She knew this was an opportunity, not just for her store, but for a bigger conversation about respect, fairness, and change. Taking a deep breath, she made a decision. "Call a press conference," she said. "It's time to set the record straight." Margaret stood in front of the podium, cameras flashing, microphones lined up, and reporters eager for her statement. The press conference had drawn an overwhelming crowd, journalists, customers, and even community leaders who admired her strength. The video of her humiliation and ultimate revelation had taken the internet by storm, and now, everyone wanted to hear from the woman at the center of it all. She adjusted the microphone and spoke with calm authority. "I never expected to be here under these circumstances. When I walked into my own store that day, I wasn't looking for special treatment, I was just looking to shop, like any other customer. But what happened to me is something that happens to countless people every day, judged not by their character, but by their appearance." The crowd nodded, murmuring in agreement. "This isn't just about me. This is about the way we treat people. It's about dignity, respect, and fairness. No one should have to prove their worth just to be treated with basic human decency." A reporter raised a hand. "Ms. Ellis, are you planning to take action against the employees involved?" Margaret paused, considering her words carefully. "I've thought a lot about that. The internet has already judged them, and I don't condone the harassment they're receiving. However, there are consequences for their actions." She looked directly into the cameras. "I will be making some serious changes at my company. We will be implementing new training, new policies, and ensuring that something like this never happens again. And as for those 2 employees," she took a deep breath, "they will be given a choice: attend extensive sensitivity training and prove they've learned from this, or find employment elsewhere." The room filled with whispers. Some expected her to fire them on the spot, but Margaret had a different approach, one that valued growth over revenge. Another reporter spoke up. "What do you hope will come from all of this?" Margaret smiled. "I hope this serves as a reminder. You never know who you're talking to. More importantly, you never know what someone has been through. Treat everyone with respect, because kindness costs nothing, but the price of discrimination can be steep." As she stepped away from the podium, the crowd erupted into applause. This moment wasn't just about her, it was about sending a message that could change the way people think, act, and treat each other. But Margaret knew this wasn't the end. There was still work to be done. The day after the press conference, Margaret arrived at the luxury store with her legal team. The store's regional manager, Mr. Calloway, was already waiting, sweating under the pressure of media scrutiny. He knew what was coming. "Ms. Ellis, he began, but Margaret held up a hand. "This isn't a negotiation, Mr. Calloway. I've made my decision," she said firmly. The store's employees stood in a tense semicircle, including Sarah and Linda, the 2 women who had humiliated her. Their faces were pale, eyes darting between Margaret and their manager. "As of today, this store will undergo a complete restructuring," Margaret announced, her voice calm but authoritative. "Effective immediately, Mr. Calloway, you are relieved of your duties." Gasps filled the room. Calloway's mouth fell open. "But, Ms. Ellis, I've been here for 10 years. I've helped this store thrive." Margaret's expression remained neutral. "And yet, in those 10 years, this kind of discrimination has gone unchecked. It happened to me, which means it's likely happened to many others. That is unacceptable." Calloway turned red with embarrassment and anger but knew he had no argument. Security escorted him out as murmurs filled the air. Margaret turned to Sarah and Linda. "I could fire you both on the spot," she said, making them flinch. "But I believe in second chances. You have a choice: take mandatory sensitivity and diversity training, or leave." Sarah hesitated, then stammered, I want to learn. I never meant." "No excuses," Margaret interrupted. Actions speak louder than words. If you want to stay, you need to prove you can treat every customer with the dignity they deserve. Linda, still shaken, nodded silently. Margaret surveyed the rest of the employees. For those of you who stood by and said nothing, let this be a lesson. Silence in the face of injustice is just as harmful as the act itself. A few employees looked down in shame. Now, Margaret continued, this store will be rebranded. New policies. New management. A place where anyone, regardless of background, feels valued and respected. She turned on her heel, heading toward the exit. The staff stood frozen, realizing that the store they once knew was about to change, forever. As Margaret exited the store, she was met with a wave of reporters eager for a statement. Cameras flashed, microphones were shoved in her direction, and voices overlapped with questions. Ms. Ellis, how does it feel to take control of the store that humiliated you? One journalist asked. Margaret gave a calm, measured smile. It's not about control, she said. It's about change. This isn't just about me, it's about ensuring that no customer is ever treated as less than based on assumptions. The crowd murmured in agreement, and the journalists scrambled to take notes. But why not just fire everyone involved? Another reporter questioned. Margaret sighed. Because education is more powerful than punishment. If I fire them, they'll go somewhere else and likely carry the same biases. But if I educate them, I give them a chance to grow. True change happens when people understand the harm they've caused and commit to doing better. The response sent a ripple through the crowd. Some nodded in admiration, others furiously typed her words into their articles. As Margaret made her way to her car, her assistant, Rachel, walked alongside her. The board wants to meet about your changes. Some shareholders are concerned about the media attention. Margaret chuckled. They should be more concerned about losing loyal customers due to discrimination. Rachel smirked. That's exactly what I told them. Margaret glanced back at the store. The place where she had once been humiliated was now under her leadership. It was poetic justice, but she wasn't doing this for revenge. She was doing it for every person who had been made to feel unworthy in places like this. Schedule the meeting, Margaret said. I have a vision, and it's time they see it. As she stepped into her car, she knew the real work was just beginning. Margaret walked into the luxury store's conference room, where the board of directors was already waiting. The air was tense. Some members exchanged wary glances, unsure of what her leadership meant for them. Ms. Ellis, one of the older board members, Mr. Whitmore, began. We respect your authority as the owner, but this store has had a certain clientele for decades. Your recent decision to go public with your experience has stirred controversy. Margaret remained calm, folding her hands on the table. What stirred controversy was the way I was treated.